Thomas McKenna's weathered hands moved methodically across the wooden fence, his calloused fingers working the hammer with practiced precision. Life on Shadow Creek Ranch was a constant dance with nature, an endless cycle of dawn-to-dusk labor that left little room for memories of his past. But on that sweltering afternoon, as dust devils twisted across the drought-stricken pasture, a gang of local troublemakers came riding up the winding dirt road in their lifted trucks. They weren't just looking for entertainment. They were vultures circling what they thought was easy prey. Thomas's jaw tightened as he caught the malicious glint in their eyes. What they didn't know was that this quiet farmer wasn't just some old man with a rusty hammer. The late summer sun beat down mercilessly on Thomas's back as he worked, his faded denim shirt dark with sweat. At 62, he wasn't as young as he used to be, but decades of working the land had kept him strong and lean. The ranch had been his sanctuary for the past 15 years, a place where he could leave behind the shadows of his former life and find peace in honest work. Most days, the only sounds were the gentle lowing of cattle, the whisper of wind through the tall grass, and the rhythmic echo of his tools. The first warning came as a distant rumble, the sound of powerful engines disturbing the tranquil afternoon. Thomas paused, his hammer suspended mid-strike as he listened to the approaching vehicles. Out here, 20 miles from the nearest town, visitors were rare and usually meant trouble. The rumbling grew louder, and soon 3 massive pickup trucks appeared on the horizon, kicking up clouds of dust as they barreled down the access road to his property. Even from a distance, Thomas could tell these weren't friendly visitors. The trucks were customized for show rather than work, their chrome accessories gleaming aggressively in the sunlight. Confederate flags fluttered from their beds, and crude slogans were painted across their tailgates. These were the kind of men who came looking for trouble, who thought their machines and their numbers made them invincible. Thomas set down his hammer and straightened slowly, his movements deliberate and controlled. His eyes, still sharp despite the years, took in every detail as the trucks drew closer. There were at least 6 men, probably more, all of them young and full of the kind of confidence that came from running unopposed in a small town. He'd heard about them from neighbors, a gang of local bullies who'd been terrorizing smaller farms and ranches in the area, taking advantage of isolated properties and overwhelmed law enforcement. The lead truck, a jacked-up Ford with mud tires that had never seen real work, skidded to a dramatic stop 30 yards from where Thomas stood. Dust billowed around the vehicles as the other 2 trucks pulled up alongside it, their engines growling like hungry predators. For a moment, nobody moved. Thomas could feel them sizing him up through their tinted windows, probably laughing at what they saw. An aging farmer, alone on his rundown ranch, an easy target for their particular brand of entertainment. The driver's door of the lead truck swung open, and a tall, muscular young man in a sleeveless shirt stepped out. His arms were covered in crude tattoos, and a cigarette dangled from his sneering lips. This was Jake Morrison, though Thomas didn't need to know his name to recognize the type, a small-town bully who mistook cruelty for strength. "Well, what do we have here?" Jake called out, his voice carrying across the yard. "Looks like we found ourselves a real-life cowboy, boys." Laughter erupted from the other trucks as more men emerged, forming a loose semicircle behind their leader. They were all cut from the same cloth, young, arrogant, and dangerous in their certainty that they were untouchable. Thomas remained still, his weathered face impassive as he watched them approach. His right hand rested casually at his side, but decades of instinct had his muscles coiled and ready. These boys might think they were looking at an easy mark, but they had no idea what they were walking into. Deep inside, in a place he'd tried to leave behind, something stirred. A familiar tension he hadn't felt in years. "Private property," Thomas said, his voice quiet but carrying easily across the yard. "Turn around and head back the way you came." His tone was neutral, neither challenging nor submissive. It was the voice of a man stating simple facts, one who had no interest in either conflict or conversation. This only seemed to amuse Jake more. He took a long drag on his cigarette before flicking it deliberately onto Thomas's property. "Private property?" he echoed mockingly. "Looks more like abandoned property to me. When's the last time this place saw any real work done?" His companions snickered, emboldened by their leader's bravado. Thomas didn't rise to the bait. He'd learned long ago that words were often just preludes to violence, and he'd seen enough violence to last several lifetimes. But as he watched these young men swagger closer, he could feel the weight of his past pressing against the careful walls he'd built around it. There was a time, not so long ago, when his name alone would have sent these boys running for their trucks. But that was another life, one he'd walked away from for good reasons. The wind picked up, sending another dust devil spinning across the yard between Thomas and his unwanted visitors. In that swirling curtain of dust and debris, for just a moment, he caught his reflection in one of the truck's chrome bumpers. The man looking back at him wasn't just the humble farmer he'd become. There were still traces of the legend he'd once been, the man who'd outdrawn the fastest guns in 3 territories and lived to walk away from it all. Jake took another step forward, sizing up the old farmer with the kind of arrogant disdain that came from years of unchallenged bullying. "You know," he drawled, running a hand through his gel-spiked hair, "we've been hearing things about this place, about how you're sitting on some prime land here, old-timer. Seems a shame to let it go to waste like this." Thomas stood his ground, neither advancing nor retreating. His eyes, the color of weathered steel, tracked every movement of the men spreading out before him. They were trying to be subtle about it, but he recognized the pattern. They were positioning themselves for intimidation, maybe violence. It was the kind of setup he'd seen countless times before, though usually in dustier saloons and on darker streets than this sun-drenched farmyard. "Nothing's going to waste here," Thomas replied evenly. "This land's being worked just fine. Now I'll say it one more time. This is private property. Get back in your trucks and leave." His voice remained calm, but there was an undertone of authority that made a couple of the younger men exchange uncertain glances. Jake's smirk widened as he reached into his back pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. "See, that's where you're wrong, old man. We've been doing our homework. County records show you're behind on your property taxes. Way behind." He unfolded the paper with theatrical slowness. "Seems to me like you might be in need of some financial assistance." A burly man with a scraggly beard and a worn leather vest stepped forward. "Yeah, we know people who might be interested in taking this place off your hands, save you the trouble of watching it fall apart." His attempt at a friendly tone was betrayed by the predatory gleam in his eyes. Thomas's expression didn't change, but something shifted in his stance, a subtle readjustment that would have been invisible to most observers. But to anyone who knew what to look for, it was the movement of a man who knew exactly how much space he needed to react. "My finances aren't your concern," he said quietly, "and I'm not selling." "Maybe you're not hearing us right," Jake said, his fake smile giving way to something harder. "We're trying to do you a favor here. This place is too much for one old man to handle. It's just a matter of time before you lose it anyway." He took another step closer, entering what most would consider personal space. "Why not make it easy on yourself?" The other men began to close in, their boots crunching on the sun-baked earth. There were 8 of them now, all young and strong, all convinced of their own invulnerability. They moved with the coordinated precision of predators who had done this before, who had practiced the art of intimidation on other lonely farms and ranches. "I remember when this place was something to see," one of them called out, kicking at a fallen fence post. "My granddad used to talk about how the McKennas kept it up. Now look at it, falling apart just like its owner." Cruel laughter followed his words. Thomas's hands remained relaxed at his sides, but his eyes had taken on a dangerous stillness. It was the kind of stillness that came before lightning struck, before a rattler launched from its coil. These boys were pushing toward a line they didn't even know existed, and they were about to cross it. "The property taxes are my business," he said, his voice carrying clearly despite its quietness. "And this land isn't for sale. Not today, not ever." He shifted his weight slightly, redistributing it in a way that would have seemed casual to most observers. "Last warning, leave now." Jake's face darkened with anger. He wasn't used to being refused, especially not by someone he saw as beneath him. "You know what your problem is, old man?" You don't know when you're beaten. Look around, there's 8 of us and 1 of you. You really want to find out how that ends? The other men began to spread out further, forming a loose circle around Thomas. They were trying to make him feel trapped, to overwhelm him with their numbers and their youth. One of them, a wiry guy with tattoos crawling up his neck, pulled out a length of chain and began wrapping it around his fist. "Maybe we need to give you a demonstration," Jake continued, cracking his knuckles. "Show you what happens to stubborn old fools who don't know what's good for them. Might have to rough up more than just your fences before you get the message." Thomas watched them move, his eyes taking in every detail, the way they positioned themselves, the weapons they carried, the distance between each man. To these young bullies, he probably looked like an easy target, an old farmer about to learn a hard lesson. But in his mind, decades of experience were calculating angles and distances, mapping out the space around him with the precision of a master geometrician. 8 against 1, Thomas said, and for the first time there was something different in his voice. Not fear, but something that made Jake hesitate for just a moment. "Seems like poor odds." He paused, then added quietly, "For you." Jake's laughter rang out across the dusty yard, but it didn't quite mask the note of uncertainty that had crept into his voice. "You hear this old-timer, boys? Thinks he's some kind of tough guy." He gestured toward the weathered farmhouse, its paint peeling in the harsh Texas sun. "What you been doing out here all alone, old man? Practicing your quick draw with the scarecrows?" Thomas remained motionless, but his mind was already cataloging the subtle details around him, the way the late afternoon sun cast shadows, the direction of the wind, the exact position of each man. Little things that most people would never notice, but that had once meant the difference between life and death. The skills were still there, buried beneath years of peaceful farming, like muscle memory that never quite fades. "Son," Thomas said quietly, "there's still time to walk away from this. Go home, forget about my land, and live to grow older than you are now." There was something in his tone, a weight to his words that made a couple of the younger men shift uncomfortably. It wasn't a threat. It was more like a prediction. But Jake was too far gone, too invested in his show of dominance to back down now. He reached behind his back and pulled out a hunting knife, its blade catching the sunlight. "You know what I think? I think you're all talk, old man. Probably been out here so long you've started believing your own stories." The man with the chain took a step forward, metal links clinking ominously. "Maybe we should see just how tough he really is, Jake. Bet he ain't so mouthy after we teach him some respect." Thomas's eyes flickered briefly to the farmhouse. Through the kitchen window, he could see the old wooden box on the top shelf, the one he hadn't opened in 15 years. Inside was a piece of his past he'd sworn never to touch again, a custom Colt single-action army revolver, its pearl grips yellowed with age, but its mechanics still as smooth as the day he'd last used it. The gun that had made him a legend in 3 territories, that had seen him through 18 official duels and countless other confrontations. "You boys ever hear stories about what this part of Texas was like 20, 30 years ago?" Thomas asked, his voice carrying easily across the yard. "About the kind of men who used to ride these territories?" One of the older men in the group, a heavy-set fellow with a graying beard, frowned slightly. "My pa used to talk about some gunslinger who cleaned up the border towns back then. Called him the—" He paused, his eyes suddenly widening as he looked more closely at Thomas. "No way. You ain't him." Thomas ignored the question, his gaze steady on Jake. There were rules back then. Honor, even among outlaws. When men had disagreements, they settled them face to face, not 8 against 1. His words carried the weight of personal experience, of lessons learned in blood and gunsmoke. Jake spun the knife in his hand, trying to mask his growing unease with bravado. "This ain't the old West anymore, Gramps. Your stories don't mean nothing out here. Times have changed." "Have they?" Thomas asked softly. "Seems to me some things never change. There's still men who prey on those they think are weaker. Still those who mistake cruelty for strength." His eyes swept the group. "Still young bucks who need to learn the hard way that appearances can be deceiving." The older man with the beard took a step back, his face pale. "Jake," he said urgently, "maybe we should think about this. If he's who I think he is—" "Shut up," Jake snapped, but his hand had started to tremble slightly. "He's nothing but a broken-down old farmer, and he's about to learn what happens when he doesn't show proper respect to his betters." Thomas sighed, a sound heavy with resignation rather than fear. "I came out here to leave that life behind, to find peace." His hands remained loose at his sides, but there was a tension in his shoulders now, a readiness that hadn't been there before. 15 years I've worked this land, trying to build something honest, trying to forget the kind of man I used to be. A hot wind gusted across the yard, stirring up dust devils that danced between the men. In that moment, something changed in Thomas's bearing, subtle but profound. It was as if a mask had slipped, revealing glimpses of someone else beneath the farmer's weathered exterior, someone dangerous, someone who had once made hardened gunfighters turn and walk away rather than face him. "Last chance," Thomas said, his voice carrying the kind of authority that could only come from having stared death in the face and won. "Get in your trucks and leave. Go home to your families. Live to see another sunrise." His eyes locked onto Jake's, and for the first time, the young bully saw something there that made his blood run cold. "Or stay and find out exactly why they used to call me Three-Shot McKenna, the man who could draw a fire and holster before most men could clear leather once." The older man with the graying beard took another step back, his face ashen. "Jake," he stammered, his voice barely above a whisper. "That's him. Three-Shot McKenna, the one my pa used to tell stories about. The one who outgunned the Martinez brothers in El Paso, both of them, before either could get off a single shot." Jake's grip on his knife tightened, his knuckles turning white. The swagger in his stance had diminished, replaced by something closer to desperation. "You're lying," he spat, but his voice cracked slightly. "That's just stories. Ancient history. Nobody's that fast." 23 seconds, Thomas said quietly, his eyes never leaving Jake's face. "That's how long it took in El Paso. Both brothers dead before they could clear their holsters. Not something I'm proud of, but it's the truth." His voice carried no boast, just the weight of a memory he'd rather forget. "Course, that was a long time ago. Maybe I've slowed down some since then." The wind picked up again, carrying with it the distant rumble of thunder. Storm clouds were gathering on the horizon, casting long shadows across the sun-baked earth. The atmosphere had changed, becoming charged with a tension that had nothing to do with the approaching weather. "You expect us to believe that?" Jake's voice had taken on a higher pitch, the kind that comes from fear trying to mask itself as courage. "Some worn-out old rancher being the legendary Three-Shot McKenna? The one they say could shoot a playing card edge on at 30 paces? Thomas's weathered face remained impassive. "Don't much care what you believe, son. Truth is truth, whether you choose to see it or not." His eyes flickered briefly to the farmhouse again, to that kitchen window where the old wooden box sat waiting. "But if you're set on finding out the hard way, I suppose that's your choice to make." One of the younger men, barely more than a boy really, had started edging toward his truck. He'd grown up hearing the legends, stories passed down in hushed voices about the gunmen who'd cleaned up the border territories when law enforcement couldn't, or wouldn't. Stories about a man who could draw and fire with supernatural speed, who never killed unless he had to, but who never missed when he did. "My grandfather," the young man said, his voice shaking. "He saw you once in Ciudad Juarez. Said you faced down 6 cartel gunmen outside the old marketplace. Said it was like watching death itself move among them." Thomas's expression softened slightly. "Your grandfather would have been talking about the Ramirez incident. That wasn't about speed or skill. Those men made bad choices, forced my hand. Just like you boys are about to do if you don't walk away." Jake's face had turned an ugly shade of red, humiliation warring with fear. "Shut up!" he shouted, waving the knife. "Just shut up with your stories. You think I care who you used to be? This is now, old man. And now you're nothing but a broken-down farmer who's about to learn some respect." But even as he spoke, his companions were starting to back away. The man with the chain had let it slip from his grip, the links rattling against the dusty ground. They'd come looking for an easy target, an old man they could intimidate and bully. Instead, they'd found something else entirely, a legend they'd thought was just campfire stories, standing before them in flesh and blood. "You know what they never put in those stories?" Thomas asked, his voice carrying across the increasingly empty space around Jake. The sound. The way a Colt single-action army sounds when it clears leather at speed. Like a whisper, but sharper. Distinctive. Some men heard it and knew right then they'd made their last mistake. Thunder rolled closer, and the first fat drops of rain began to fall, raising puffs of dust where they hit the parched earth. One by one, Jake's companions were retreating to their trucks, engines starting up with nervous revs. "If even half the stories about you are true," the older man with the beard said, backing away, "then we've made a terrible mistake here today. I'm sorry, Mr. McKenna. We didn't know." His voice carried genuine fear now, the kind that comes from realizing you've been playing with fire while soaked in gasoline. Jake stood alone now, his knife seemingly heavier in his trembling hand. The rain was falling harder, plastering his expensive shirt to his skin, but he seemed not to notice. His eyes were wide, darting between Thomas and the retreating trucks of his companions. "A smart man," Thomas said softly, "knows when to walk away. Your friends seem to have figured that out. Question is, are you smart enough to follow their lead? Or are you going to make me prove who I am in a way neither of us wants?" The rain was falling steadily now, drumming against the tin roof of the barn and turning the dusty yard into a sea of mud. Jake stood rooted in place, his expensive boots sinking into the softening earth, while the last of his companions' trucks roared away down the access road. Their taillights disappeared into the gathering gloom, leaving him alone with the man he'd come to intimidate, the man who now seemed to fill the entire yard with his presence. "What's it going to be, son?" Thomas asked, his voice barely audible above the rain. "You can still walk away from this. Go home, dry off, and thank whatever God you believe in that you didn't push this any further." Water ran down his weathered face, but he seemed not to notice it. His focus remained entirely on Jake, watching, waiting. Jake's chest heaved with rapid breaths, his knife glinting dully in the fading light. "You're lying," he said again. But the words sounded hollow even to his own ears. "You can't be him. He'd be dead by now, or in some fancy ranch house living off his reputation, not out here in this rundown place." Thomas shook his head slowly, rain dripping from the brim of his hat. "You still don't understand, do you? I came here to get away from all that. From the killing, the reputation, the whispers in every saloon about three-shot McKenna." His voice carried a weight of memories, of choices made and paths taken. "This farm, this simple life, it's not a punishment, it's redemption." Lightning split the sky, illuminating the yard in stark white light. In that brief flash, Jake caught a glimpse of something in Thomas's eyes that made his blood run cold. A kind of deadly certainty, a look he'd seen in documentaries about predators in the wild. But you're just a farmer now," Jake protested, his voice cracking. "You said it yourself. You left that life behind. You can't." He trailed off as Thomas took a single step forward. "Son, let me tell you something about men like me," Thomas said, his words cutting through the sound of rain. "We don't stop being who we are just because we choose a different path. Every morning I wake up and choose peace, choose this simple life. But that doesn't mean I've forgotten how to be the other man, the one your friends are running from right now." Jake's knife hand was shaking visibly now. The rain had soaked him completely, his carefully styled hair plastered to his skull, making him look younger and more vulnerable than he had just minutes ago. "I've killed 37 men," Thomas continued, his voice matter-of-fact. "Each one made the choice to force my hand, just like you're thinking about doing right now. Each one thought they were faster, stronger, better. Each one was wrong." He paused, letting the words sink in. "I haven't added to that number in 15 years, and I'd like to keep it that way." Thunder rolled overhead, closer now, making the ground vibrate beneath their feet. Jake's eyes darted to his truck, parked barely 30 yards away, but it might as well have been 30 miles for all the good it would do him. "The papers called me 3-shot because that's all it ever took," Thomas said, taking another slow step forward. "Draw fire holster, faster than most men could blink. The gun in that box up there in my kitchen." He nodded toward the farmhouse. "It's seen more death than any weapon should. I promised myself I'd never touch it again. But for you, son, I wouldn't need it. You're holding a knife like you've never had to use it for anything more dangerous than opening packages." Jake's arm dropped slightly, the knife point dipping toward the mud. I didn't know," he stammered. "We just thought, everyone said you were just some old man who couldn't keep his farm up, said you were an easy mark." "And what have you learned?" Thomas asked, his voice gentle now, almost fatherly. "About judging men by appearances? About thinking you can measure someone's worth by the state of their property or the age in their face?" The knife slipped from Jake's fingers, disappearing into the mud with a soft plop. His shoulders slumped, the last of his bravado draining away with the rain. "I'm sorry," he whispered, the words nearly lost in a crack of thunder. "I'm sorry, Mr. McKenna. We never should have. I never should have." "No," Thomas agreed quietly. "You shouldn't have. But you're young yet, with time to learn better ways. Question is, will you? Or will you be back here another day, making the same mistakes with potentially deadlier consequences?" Jake shook his head violently, sending water flying from his hair. "No, sir, never. I swear it. I'll make sure the others know too, about who you are, about leaving this place alone." The storm was beginning to pass, the heavy rain softening to a gentle drizzle that misted the air between Thomas and Jake. The young man stood there looking lost and much smaller than he had when he'd first swaggered onto the property. His expensive clothes were ruined, caked with mud, but he seemed not to notice or care. "Good," Thomas said, his voice carrying that same quiet authority. "But it's not my name you need to spread around. It's the lesson you learned here today." He gestured at the muddy yard around them, at the modest farm that had seemed such an easy target just an hour ago. About judging books by their covers, about thinking you can measure a man's worth by what you can see on the surface. Lightning flickered in the distance, followed by the muted growl of thunder rolling away to the east. Jake shifted uncomfortably, unable to meet Thomas's steady gaze. "The stories about you," he said hesitantly. "About 3-shot McKenna. My grandfather used to tell them, but I never believed. Said you were like a ghost appearing wherever trouble was brewing, setting things right." Thomas's weathered face remained impassive, but something flickered in his eyes, a shadow of memories perhaps, or old regrets. "Stories grow in the telling," he said quietly. "But yes, there was a time when I moved through these territories, dealing with men who thought their guns made them gods, men who preyed on those they saw as weak." His gaze hardened slightly. "Men not so different from what you're becoming." Jake flinched as if he'd been struck. "I'm not. We weren't." He trailed off, realizing how hollow his protests sounded. "Not what?" Thomas pressed, his voice razor-sharp. "Not trying to intimidate an old man? Not planning to use force to take what isn't yours? Not running with a pack of wolves, thinking numbers make you invincible?" He took a step closer, and despite the inches Jake had on him in height, the younger man seemed to shrink. "Tell me, son, what exactly were you planning to do here today?" The question hung in the rain-washed air between them. Jake opened his mouth, closed it again, his face flushing with shame. He swallowed hard. "We were going to scare you. Maybe rough you up a bit. Make you see that selling was your only option." Thomas nodded slowly, as if this confirmation of what he'd already known carried its own weight. "And if I'd been exactly what you thought I was, just an aging farmer, alone and vulnerable, would that have made it right?" "No, sir," Jake whispered, the words barely audible above the pattering of the dying rain. "No," Thomas agreed. "It wouldn't have. And that's the real lesson here, son. Not who I used to be, Not what I can still do if pushed. He gestured toward the distant road where Jake's companions had fled. Your friends ran because they discovered I'm dangerous, but they should have run because what they were doing was wrong. A shaft of late afternoon sunlight broke through the dispersing clouds, casting long shadows across the muddy yard. Jake stood in silence for a long moment, water dripping from his clothes, his earlier bravado replaced by something that looked like genuine reflection. How? He started, then seemed to gather his courage. How did you become him? Three-shot McKenna? Thomas's expression softened slightly, touched perhaps by the genuine curiosity in the younger man's voice. Not by choice, he said quietly. Started with standing up to men like you're becoming. Men who thought might made right, who saw gentleness as weakness. Had to learn to be faster, deadlier. Not because I wanted to, but because someone had to stand between the wolves and their prey. He turned slightly, looking out over his modest farm, the weathered buildings, the fence line that needed mending, the fields waiting for the next day's labor. But that path, he continued, it takes things from you. Each man you put in the ground, justified or not, takes a piece of your soul with him. That's why I came here, tried to build something instead of just destroying. Jake followed his gaze, seeing the property with new eyes. What had looked like a run-down farm now seemed something else, a sanctuary perhaps, or a form of penance. Why are you telling me all this? He asked finally. Because you're standing at a crossroads, son, Thomas replied, turning back to face him. Just like I was many years ago. You can keep going the way you have been, running with a pack, thinking power comes from causing fear. Or you can choose another path. Build something. Create instead of destroy. Be the kind of man who protects others instead of preying on them. The last rays of sunlight were breaking through the dispersing storm clouds, casting a golden glow across the rain-soaked farm. Jake stood there, mud caking his expensive boots, looking less like the swaggering bully who had arrived, and more like a chastened boy, receiving a hard but necessary lesson. There's a story they don't tell about Three-Shot McKenna, Thomas said, his voice taking on a distant quality. About the last man I faced in a gunfight. Young buck, not much older than you. Had a reputation for being quick, for pushing other men into fights he knew he could win. He paused, letting the memory surface. Found me in a saloon in Ciudad Acuña, called me out in front of everyone. Jake listened intently, his earlier fear giving way to a kind of mesmerized fascination. What happened to him? I tried to walk away, Thomas continued. Told him there was no profit in dying young, that he had time to choose a better path. But he wouldn't have it. Said his reputation demanded he face the legendary McKenna. A shadow crossed his weathered face. He was fast, I'll give him that. Fast and skilled. But being quick on the draw isn't enough when you're fighting for the wrong reasons. Thomas walked over to a fallen fence post, running his hand along the water-darkened wood. I didn't kill him. Could have, probably should have, by the rules of those days. But something in his eyes when he realized he'd lost. It reminded me of myself at that age. So instead of putting him in the ground, I shot the gun out of his hand. Left him with a choice about what kind of man he wanted to become. Did you ever see him again? Jake asked, drawn into the story despite himself. Once, Thomas nodded. About 10 years later. He'd become a Texas Ranger, one of the best. Said that day changed him. Made him realize there was more to being a man than being the fastest gun. He fixed Jake with a penetrating stare. Sometimes mercy teaches better lessons than violence. The wind had died down completely now, leaving the farm in an almost supernatural stillness. Water dripped from the eaves of the barn, each drop striking the puddles below with crystalline clarity. Your friends? Thomas said, gesturing toward the empty road. They ran because they discovered who I used to be. But you're still here, facing what you've done. That takes a different kind of courage. The question is, what are you going to do with this moment? Jake shifted his weight, looking down at his mud-covered clothes. We started small, just messing with people, throwing our weight around. It felt good, being feared, being respected. He looked up, meeting Thomas's steady gaze. But it wasn't really respect, was it? No, Thomas agreed quietly. Fear and respect are different animals entirely. One's a rattler, quick to strike but leaving nothing but poison behind. The other's more like this land, demanding honest work and patience, but giving back something worth having. A distant rumble of thunder served as punctuation to his words. Jake ran a hand through his rain-flattened hair, looking suddenly much younger than his years. The others, they'll be waiting to hear what happened. Probably expecting me to come back with some story about standing up to you, about not being scared off. Thomas's expression remained neutral, but his eyes held a hint of approval at the young man's honesty. And what will you tell them? The truth, Jake said after a long moment. About who you are, about what you taught me, about how I was becoming something I never meant to be. He straightened slightly, as if shedding a weight from his shoulders. Maybe some of them will listen, maybe they won't. But I'm done being part of it. That's a start, Thomas nodded. But words are wind without actions to back them up. If you're serious about changing your path, you'll need to prove it. Not to me, to yourself. Jake looked around the farm, taking in the damage they'd caused. The trampled crops, the broken fence posts, the churned-up earth where their trucks had torn through. I want to make this right, he said finally. Not because of who you were, or what you could do to me, but because it's the right thing to do. Thomas studied him for a long moment, measuring the sincerity in his words. There's work needs doing here, he said finally. Fences to mend, ground to be worked back into shape. Could use an extra pair of hands if you're serious about making amends. The offer hung in the air between them, weighted with more than just the prospect of physical labor. It was a chance at redemption, at learning a different kind of strength than what Jake had been pursuing. When do I start? Jake asked, and for the first time since arriving at the farm, his voice carried no trace of its former arrogance. The next morning arrived with a burst of golden sunlight streaming across Shadow Creek Ranch. Thomas was already up, his worn boots leaving tracks in the dew-dampened grass as he made his way to the barn. The storm had passed, leaving behind a freshly washed world and air that smelled of wet earth and new possibilities. He paused at the barn door, listening to the familiar sounds of morning, cattle lowing in the distance, birds greeting the dawn, and now, the distinctive rumble of an approaching vehicle. Jake's truck appeared on the horizon, but it was different from yesterday. The oversized tires had been replaced with standard ones, the aggressive lift kit was gone, and the Confederate flag was notably absent. As the vehicle drew closer, Thomas could see that even Jake looked transformed. Gone were the designer clothes and carefully styled hair, replaced by worn jeans, work boots, and a simple cotton shirt. The truck came to a stop in the yard, and Jake stepped out looking almost uncertain without his usual swagger. In the clear morning light, he seemed younger somehow, more vulnerable. He carried a bag over his shoulder, and what looked like a packed lunch in his hand. "Wasn't sure you'd come," Thomas said quietly, watching as Jake made his way across the yard. "Almost didn't," Jake admitted, his voice carrying a new kind of honesty. "Spent half the night thinking about everything you said, about the kind of man I've been becoming." He gestured at his truck, made some changes, figured if I'm going to start over, might as well start with how I present myself to the world. Thomas nodded approvingly, noting the humility in Jake's bearing. "Changes on the outside are easy enough," he said. "It's the ones on the inside that take real work. Speaking of which." He turned toward the damaged section of the farm, where yesterday's confrontation had left its mark. "We've got plenty to do." For the next few hours they worked in companionable silence, their labor punctuated only by Thomas's occasional instructions. Jake proved to be a quick learner, his natural strength now channeled into productive work rather than intimidation. His hands, soft from easy living, began to develop their first honest calluses. As the morning wore on, other vehicles began appearing on the horizon. At first Thomas tensed, his old instincts kicking in, but these weren't the aggressive trucks from yesterday. One by one, Jake's former companions arrived, each looking as transformed as he had. They parked quietly, emerged without their usual bravado, and stood awkwardly at the edge of the property. "They came," Jake said softly, straightening from where he'd been mending a fence post. "I told them what happened, what you said. About choosing different paths, about real strength, didn't think they'd listen, but—" He shrugged, a small smile playing at his lips. "Guess your words hit home with more than just me." Thomas studied the group, seeing not the threatening gang from yesterday, but a collection of young men looking for direction. Some carried tools, others had brought water coolers and lunchboxes. All wore expressions that mixed shame with determination. "Mr. McKenna," one of them called out, the older man with the graying beard who had first recognized Thomas's name. We'd like to help. Make right what we did wrong, if you'll have us." Thomas leaned on his shovel, considering the offer. These were the same men who had come to terrorize him just yesterday, yet something had shifted. Whether it was the revelation of his identity or the harder truths he'd spoken to Jake, something had cracked their shell of arrogance. "There's plenty of work to go around," he said finally. "But understand this. You're not here because of who I used to be. You're here to learn about who you can become. The kind of men who build things instead of tearing them down." They nodded solemnly, and one by one, made their way onto the property. Under Thomas's quiet guidance, they spread out across the damaged areas. Some began clearing debris, others started repairs on the trampled crops, and a few joined Jake at the fence line. As the sun climbed higher, Thomas watched them work. Their movements were clumsy at first, unused to honest labor, but there was a genuine effort in everything they did. Occasionally, one would pause to ask a question or seek guidance, and Thomas found himself sharing not just farming knowledge, but life lessons wrapped in simple instructions about post-hole diggers and proper seed spacing. "You know," Jake said during a water break, wiping sweat from his brow, "my grandfather used to say that 3-shot McKenna never left a place worse than he found it, always tried to make things better even after the shooting was done." He looked around at his former gang, now transformed into a working crew. Guess he was right about that too. Days turned into weeks, and the transformation at Shadow Creek Ranch was nothing short of remarkable. Under Thomas's quiet guidance, the once threatening gang of young men had become a dedicated work crew, showing up regularly to help with farm tasks that went far beyond just repairing the damage they'd caused. The change wasn't just in the landscape, it was evident in the men themselves. Jake had emerged as a natural leader, but in a completely different way than before. Where he had once led through intimidation and bravado, he now led by example, always the first to arrive and the last to leave. His hands, once soft from easy living, had developed the calluses and strength that came from honest work. The designer clothes remained in his closet, replaced by worn jeans and sweat-stained work shirts. One particular morning, as Thomas watched Jake skillfully guide a nervous new calf through its first feeding, he noticed something that made him smile. The young man's movements were careful, gentle, a far cry from the swaggering bully who had arrived at his farm that stormy day. "You've got away with them," Thomas observed, leaning against the barn door. "The animals sense when someone's genuine, can't fool them with false bravado." Jake looked up, a mix of pride and humility in his expression. "Learned that from you," he said, gently patting the calf's flank. "About being strong enough to be gentle, about how real power isn't about making others fear you." The sound of approaching vehicles drew their attention. More of the former gang members were arriving for the day's work, their trucks now carrying tools and supplies instead of threatening ornaments. They parked in an orderly fashion, a sharp contrast to their first chaotic arrival weeks ago. "Word's getting around town," Jake said, securing the calf in its pen. "About the changes here, about what you're teaching us." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "Some folks don't believe it, that 3-shot McKenna is running what amounts to a reform school for local troublemakers." Thomas's expression remained neutral, but there was a glimmer of amusement in his eyes. "Let them talk," he said. "Actions speak louder than words, and your actions are speaking volumes." The other men had gathered near the barn, waiting for the day's assignments. Thomas studied them, noting how different they looked now. The aggressive posturing was gone, replaced by the quiet confidence that comes from knowing your own worth. Even their conversations had changed, Instead of boasting about intimidation and violence, they discussed farming techniques, weather patterns, and the satisfaction of seeing things grow. "You know," one of them spoke up. The older man with the graying beard who had first recognized Thomas. "My daddy used to say that Three-Shot McKenna had this way about him. Said he could look into a man's soul and see what he could become, not just what he was." Thomas shook his head slightly. "Your daddy gave me too much credit. All I ever did was give men a choice. Same choice I'm giving all of you. About what kind of mark you want to leave on the world." The men nodded, understanding the deeper meaning behind his words. They had all heard the stories now, about the legendary gunmen who had cleaned up the border territories. But here at Shadow Creek Ranch, they were learning about a different kind of strength, a different kind of legacy. "Today we're starting something new," Thomas announced, gesturing toward the far field. Previous owner of this land used to run a program for troubled youth. Had them working the earth, learning responsibility. Time we brought that back. The men exchanged glances, realization dawning on their faces. They had been part of the problem in town, but now they had a chance to be part of the solution. "You think we're ready for that?" Jake asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. Thomas surveyed the group, seeing not the gang that had threatened him, but men who had chosen a different path. "You've learned about honest work, about building instead of destroying. Now it's time to pass that on to others who need it." The men straightened, understanding the responsibility being placed in their hands. They had come to Shadow Creek Ranch as threats and bullies, but they were leaving as mentors and teachers. "Three-Shot McKenna," Jake mused, shaking his head with a smile. "The stories always talked about how fast you were with a gun, but they never mentioned this part, about how you could change lives without ever touching a weapon." Thomas's weathered face creased in a rare smile. "Sometimes the biggest changes come not from what we can destroy, but from what we choose to build." He looked out over his land at the fields they had restored together. "And sometimes the strongest men are the ones who know when to put down their weapons and pick up tools instead." The autumn sun cast long shadows across Shadow Creek Ranch as Thomas stood on his porch, watching a new group of troubled teens arrive with their parents. Jake and his crew had organized everything, transforming the old barn into a proper classroom space where farming techniques would be taught alongside life lessons. The symbolism wasn't lost on Thomas. The same barn where he'd once faced down a gang of bullies was now becoming a place of transformation. "Still hard to believe sometimes," Jake said, joining Thomas on the porch. He'd grown into his new role with surprising grace, his former aggression replaced by a quiet confidence that drew others to him naturally. "A year ago, we were the ones causing trouble in town. Now look at us." Thomas nodded, observing how Jake's former gang members, now respected mentors, were greeting the new arrivals. Each of them carried themselves differently now, with the kind of assurance that comes not from intimidating others, but from knowing your own worth. "You know what I've been thinking about lately?" Jake continued, his voice thoughtful. "That first day, when we came here looking for trouble, you could have drawn that gun from the kitchen, shown us exactly why they called you Three-Shot McKenna. But you didn't." Thomas's weathered face remained impassive, but his eyes held a depth of understanding. "Some lessons can't be taught at gunpoint," he said quietly. "Real change, the kind that lasts, has to come from within." A pickup truck pulled into the yard, and Thomas recognized the driver, the local sheriff, Marcus Rodriguez. The law enforcement official had been skeptical at first about Thomas's rehabilitation program, but the results were hard to argue with. Juvenile crime rates in the county had dropped significantly since Shadow Creek Ranch had started accepting troubled youth. "McKenna," the sheriff called out as he approached the porch. "Got those registration papers you asked for. Official now, Shadow Creek Youth Development Program." He handed over a folder, then surveyed the scene before him. "Still can't quite believe it. Three-Shot McKenna, legendary gunslinger, running a farm rehabilitation program for wayward kids." Thomas accepted the papers with a nod. "Times change, Marcus. We all have to find our own ways to make the world better." The sheriff's eyes moved to Jake. "And you. Your daddy would be proud, seeing what you've made of yourself. Gone from leading a gang to leading these kids toward something better. Jake's face flushed slightly at the praise, but he stood straighter. "Learn from the best," he said, glancing at Thomas, "about how real strength isn't about making others fear you, but about helping them find their own strength." As they talked, more families arrived. Thomas watched as the new teens, all trying to hide their uncertainty behind masks of toughness, were greeted by his crew. He could see their surprise when they realized their mentors weren't some soft-hearted do-gooders, but men who had walked the same hard roads they were on now. "You see that kid there?" Jake said, pointing to a young man with a rebellious set to his jaw. "Reminds me of myself way I was before, full of anger, thinking the only way to be strong is to make others weak." Thomas nodded. "And now you know better. That's why you're the one who can reach him." The sheriff shook his head in amazement. "You know, McKenna, all those years ago when you were cleaning up the border territories, people used to say you had a special kind of magic in that gun hand of yours. But this..." He gestured at the transformed ranch and the lives being changed there. "This is a different kind of magic altogether." "No magic to it," Thomas replied. "Just giving people the chance to choose a different path. Same chance I got when I put down my gun and picked up a plow." As the morning progressed, Thomas watched Jake and his crew begin their orientation with the new arrivals. They started not in the classroom, but in the fields, letting the teens feel the earth beneath their fingers, teaching them about the patience and care required to help things grow. "Your legacy's changing, you know," the sheriff said quietly. "Used to be, people told stories about three-shot McKenna, the fastest gun in 3 territories. Now they're starting to tell different stories about the man who taught troubled souls how to grow something better than violence." Thomas's eyes crinkled at the corners, the closest he usually came to a smile. "Maybe that's the way it should be," he said. "Maybe the best stories aren't about what we can destroy, but about what we can build together." In the distance, thunder rolled across the plains, but this time it brought no threat, only the promise of rain to nourish the newly planted fields. Thomas McKenna, once known for his lightning-fast draw, now watched a different kind of transformation unfold, one measured not in seconds and gunshots, but in seasons and growing things, in lives turned around and lessons passed down. The legend of three-shot McKenna was changing, evolving into something that would last longer than any tale of gunfights or frontier justice. It was becoming a story of redemption, of second chances, of the kind of strength that comes not from the speed of your draw, but from the depth of your commitment to helping others find their way. As the sun began to set on Shadow Creek Ranch, casting a warm golden glow across the fields, Thomas stood at the edge of his property, watching the last of the day's visitors drive away. The transformation of his land, and the people on it, had become something far greater than he'd ever imagined. What had started as a confrontation with a group of local troublemakers had grown into a beacon of hope for the entire community. Jake approached, wiping the sweat from his brow after a long day of mentoring. "You ever miss it?" he asked quietly. "The old life, the reputation, being three-shot McKenna?" Thomas turned to face his young protege, seeing in him the kind of change he'd always hoped was possible. "Miss being feared?" he replied, his voice thoughtful. "Number. But I do think about it sometimes, about all the men I faced, all the lives that ended at the end of my gun." The evening breeze carried the sweet scent of alfalfa across the ranch, mixing with the earthy smell of freshly tilled soil. In the distance, the new crop of troubled teens was helping to clean up for the day, their initial resistance already beginning to soften under the guidance of Jake and his crew. "You know," Thomas continued, "every man I ever faced in a gunfight thought they were choosing power. They thought being feared meant being respected." He gestured at the flourishing farm around them. "But real power, the kind that matters, looks more like this, like watching something grow, like helping others find their way." Jake nodded, understanding flowing deeper than words. "The younger kids, they ask about the story sometimes, about three-shot McKenna and the gunfights, but that's not what they really need to hear about, is it?" "No," Thomas agreed. "They need to hear about choices, about how it's never too late to change your path, to become something better than what you started as." He paused, watching as one of the older mentors patiently showed a teenager how to properly coil a length of rope. Every man I ever drew against had that choice. Most of them just couldn't see it. The sound of distant thunder rolled across the plains, bringing with it memories of that fateful rainy day when Jake and his gang had first arrived at Shadow Creek Ranch. But now, instead of tension and threat, the thunder seemed to carry a different message, one of renewal and growth. "Sheriff Rodriguez said something interesting today," Jake mentioned, leaning against the fence post. "Said he's been getting calls from other counties, asking about our program. Seems word's spreading about what's happening here." Thomas's weathered face remained impassive, but there was a glimmer of satisfaction in his eyes. "Three-Shot McKenna used to be known for ending things," he said quietly. "Maybe now the name can be known for helping things begin." As twilight deepened into dusk, the lights in the converted barn classroom cast a warm glow across the yard. Inside, some of the older teens were attending evening classes, not just learning about farming, but about life, about responsibility, about the kind of strength that comes from building rather than destroying. "You know what I've learned here?" Jake said, his voice carrying the weight of genuine revelation. "Being feared is easy. Anyone with enough cruelty can make people afraid. But being respected, being someone who helps others find their way, that's the real challenge." Thomas nodded slowly. "Took me years to learn that lesson. Had to put a lot of men in the ground before I figured out there had to be a better way." He looked at Jake, seeing not the angry young man who had tried to intimidate him, but the leader he had become. "You learned it faster than I did." The last rays of sunlight painted the clouds in brilliant shades of orange and purple, a fitting backdrop to the day's end at Shadow Creek Ranch. The legend of Three-Shot McKenna was still alive, but it was evolving, becoming something more meaningful than tales of quick draws and deadly accuracy. "Tomorrow's another day," Thomas said finally, pushing away from the fence. "Another chance to help these kids see what you saw, that there's more to strength than making others weak, more to power than making others afraid." Jake straightened up, his posture reflecting the responsibility he'd grown into. "And that's the real legacy of Three-Shot McKenna," he said with quiet certainty. "Not how many men you outgunned, but how many lives you helped turn around." As they walked back toward the main house, the evening stars beginning to twinkle overhead, Thomas reflected on the strange turns life could take. He had come to this quiet corner of Texas looking for peace, for a way to leave his violent past behind. Instead, he had found something more valuable, a way to transform that past into something that could help others find their own path to redemption. The legend of Three-Shot McKenna would live on, but not as a tale of lightning-fast draws and deadly accuracy. Instead, it would be remembered as a story of transformation, of second chances, and of the kind of strength that comes not from the power to take life, but from the wisdom to help others build better ones. The morning dawned crisp and clear over Shadow Creek Ranch, the kind of Texas morning that held all the promise of new beginnings. Thomas McKenna stood on his porch, coffee cup in hand, watching as the first rays of sunlight painted the horizon in shades of gold and pink. The ranch had changed in ways he never could have imagined when he'd first bought it, seeking solitude and redemption. A line of vehicles was already appearing on the horizon, not the threatening trucks of troublemakers this time, but parents bringing their children to the ranch's program, former gang members arriving to mentor, and even a few reporters who'd caught wind of the remarkable transformation taking place at Shadow Creek Ranch. Jake pulled up in his truck, now modified for farm work rather than intimidation. "Got something to show you," he said, climbing out with a newspaper in his hand. Made the front page of the county paper. Thomas took the offered paper, his weathered eyes scanning the headline. "From gunslinger to guiding light. Three-Shot McKenna's Shadow Creek Ranch transforms lives." Below was a photo of the ranch, showing teenagers working alongside their mentors in the fields, learning about more than just farming. "Never thought I'd see my name in print again," Thomas said quietly. "Least not in this kind of story." Jake leaned against the porch railing, his posture relaxed but respectful. "You know what's funny? The stories about Three-Shot McKenna used to scare people. Now they're giving people hope. The sound of more vehicles approaching drew their attention. A school bus was making its way up the drive, carrying a new group of troubled youth from the city. Behind it, pickup trucks filled with tools and supplies formed a steady stream, all driven by men who had once been part of Jake's gang, now transformed into mentors and teachers. Sheriff Rodriguez says juvenile crime in the county is down 60% since we started the program, Jake continued. Says he's never seen anything like it. The same kids who used to cause trouble are now helping others stay out of it. Thomas set down his coffee cup, his eyes tracking the arrival of the day's participants. You remember what I told you that first day? About how being feared isn't the same as being respected? Jake nodded, a smile playing at his lips. Never forgot it. Changed everything for me. For all of us. The morning activity was picking up now. Former troublemakers were greeting new arrivals, their own transformations serving as living proof of what was possible. The converted barn classroom was filling with voices, not angry or defiant now, but eager to learn and grow. You know, Thomas said, his voice carrying the weight of years of experience. When I was 3-shot McKenna, I thought I was making the territories better by taking out the bad elements. Never occurred to me that maybe those bad elements just needed a different path. A young teenager walked past, head down, trying to project toughness. Jake watched him with understanding eyes. That was me not so long ago, thinking the only way to be strong was to make others afraid. Thomas nodded slowly. And now you're teaching others what real strength looks like, the kind that builds up instead of tearing down. The morning sun had climbed higher, burning away the last traces of dawn mist. In the fields, work groups were forming, troubled teens paired with mentors who had walked the same hard road and found their way to something better. Your legend's growing again, Jake said, but with a different kind of respect in his voice. Not as the fastest gun in 3 territories, but as something more important. People are starting to understand that the real power of 3-shot McKenna wasn't in how fast he could draw, but in how he could see the potential in others. Thomas's weathered face creased in a rare smile. Maybe that's the way it should be. Maybe the best legends aren't about what we can destroy, but about what we can build together.